Okay, second try. The first try, the microphone wasn't. It was on, but it wasn't activated. Anyway, so this is chapter 3, I believe, of the Rediscovery of America. Yeah, we're on 3, and this one's going to cover the French. We've been through the British, or the Puritans specifically. We've been through the oh shit. Okay, we've been through the Puritans. We've been through the Spanish, and now we're at the French. It starts out by just laying out the French settlements. It said that they had a, what's it called? Like a string. Yeah, like a string of settlements that lined the St. Lawrence. At Quebec and Trois River, churches, fields, and stone walls dotted the shorelines. Goes on. And here in this chapter, it'll lay out, in my opinion, most explicitly that like disease was the biggest killer, and disease was the biggest cause of the decline of Native Americans. How much? Anyway. There's a lot of early stuff that's going to be skipped here. Scale of it also lays out how big France's colonies will get. Quote, by 1700, France laid claims to 2/3 of North America, from eastern Canada to the Mississippi and New Orleans. It says that New France would be the largest colony in the Americas, and it would precede like a lot of areas that the British would end up getting into. It lays out the like sort of, as much as this is like meant to center Native Americans, the main character of this chapter, I would say, is Champlain. He's the governor and / explorer of the Americas, and he leads an attack against the Iroquois Confederation, I believe, or no, Iroquois Confederacy. I don't know what I don't know what the difference is. Anyway, in July of 1609, during Champlain's first full year as governor, he, his men, and several hundred of their Montagnais and Algonquin allies gathered to fight Mohawk forces. The Mohawks are one of the nations in the Iroquois Confederacy. This pushed the Iroquois into a more militaristic direction. The book lays out that the Iroquois initially were more diplomatic focused, or they were more famed for diplomacy, but basically because of European influence and trade, they become much, much more aggressive. Very briefly, it lays out that Iroquois women during the period would have an even more powerful role in Iroquois society. Apparently, they were already Iroquois women were already a significant political force in Iroquois life, but I think it's the warring that would make them even more prominent. Quote, quote, similarly, life for Iroquois women changed. For centuries, Iroquois women have held power within their villages and across the Confederacy. Iroquois clans are matrilineal, and children are expected to remain members of the mother's clan. Farming rights, the rights to appoint and remove political leaders, the right to demand retribution for lost lives, and other communal powers have remained under the jurisdiction of women throughout Iroquois history. So, the attack on the Iroquois by Champlain does not go well. Or, well, it goes well for him sort of initially. He attacks a palisade at one point and defeats it. He kills or captures nearly 100 Mohawks, and the book says that this is a significant loss, as their military would have been between 5 to 8,000 men. Then it goes on to lay out how how he pushes even farther and goes and attacks Onondaga. I hope I'm pronouncing that at least close to correctly. And he attacks this area again, or well, he attacks. I believe Onondaga is another clan that is also a member of the Iroquois Confederacy, or another nation that's a member of the Iroquois Confederacy. This one he fails. He just fails outright, it seems, and so the Iroquois survive. And then this is where we get into after the assault, Champlain dies. But then, after that, this is where we have to talk about the Dutch. It laid out something very interesting here. Quote, inspired by the wealth the Spanish had amassed by colonization, the Dutch oversaw an empire that ranged from Guyana to Indonesia. Throughout the 1600s, Dutch businessmen looked for new trading opportunities, positioned themselves atop the Atlantic's mercantile networks, and worked to avoid labor-intensive, agricultural-based colonies. It lays out later that the reason that the Dutch did this, or perhaps one of the supposed reasons, is because Holland has way fewer people in it than England or France does, so they just have to set up like small outposts to trade with people. They don't have the luxury of setting up big, giant colonies that will, farm the land and can take heavy losses and that they can spread out. So that's what they do. I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. The main thing here, in 1600, Dutch traders began offering metals, cloth, and wares for trade. In exchange, native people harvested furs, provided food and hospitality, and even joined military actions. The fur is by far the biggest. It's the thing that's most laid out. The food that's given and the hospitality and all that's not laid out very much. But furs, you better believe that they lay out how much the native people are giving the Dutch furs in exchange for tools and metals and such. The Mohawks go to war with the Mahican, Mahican. It says that the war ends in 1628, and the Mohawks are victorious. They drive the Mohicans east of the Hudson River and away from Fort Orange. Fort Orange is a Dutch trading post. I'm almost 100% certain. I'm, again, 100% certain it gets its name from William of Orange. But anyway. Or, well, I guess it would have gotten it. I don't know. I'm sorry, this book's not on Dutch history, and I'm not a Dutch historian. But anyway, you get the point. The Mohawks drive away the Mohicans to secure better trade relations with the Dutch. It lays out the suffering of the Mohicans. The Mohican, in contrast, became displaced and needed to reconstitute themselves. I don't know if this is similar to the ethnogenesis thing we talked about in last chapter. I'd assume it is, but it doesn't say explicitly. So, the effects of warfare, disease had reduced their initially promising ties with the Dutch. They became the first Algonquin-speaking nation dispersed in what became a broader Iroquois-influenced diaspora. Yeah, the Iroquois. This is the beginning. The Iroquois, just unload throughout this chapter. Let's see. Quick word on disease again. It goes back and forth a bit, and then we'll get back into the Iroquois quickly. A small pox outbreak was reported across Iroquois in 1634. It was the first of three in under 6 years. These outbreaks devastated New France's Indian allies as much as any other force. Epidemics shaped Indian survival strategy and determined the texture of diplomacy. I wish I could find the specific quote that laid out how devastating disease was, because there is a quote in this chapter, chapter 3, about how devastating disease was, and it pretty much explicitly says that it is the most powerful force here. So if you're, oh my god, I keep setting my phone on the table and it keeps messing with the microphone. Anything that touches, it doesn't matter. Anything that like hits the desk seems to screw with the microphone. Anyway, so if you were wondering, as a kid, why disease seemed to be just so one direction, why it seemed that the Native Americans got hit by disease and like the Europeans didn't seem to be as affected, or like how did that come about where the Europeans come over and like so many of them are dying to diseases? This book lays out perhaps not a theory, but it has like an answer. It answers that question on its own sorts. Quote, at the crossroads of African and Asian trade networks, Europeans had suffered disease-ridden centuries, especially in Northern and Eastern Europe. Such exposure and the use of domestic livestock combined to foster greater immunities throughout Europe's populations. Even though the specter of disease haunted their memories and folklore, Europeans emerged from the Dark Ages primed for global encounters. History, not biology, provided clear, if unseen, advantages. So that's the book's take. It's not, obviously the book isn't about, I don't know, virology or whatever. So I sort of take it with like a grain of salt, and I'm sure it's not like a very conclusive answer. But that's the one it provides. So, take it for what it's worth. After that is, I have, in my notes section, I have things that just say skip. So I have to, skip it. Because not every note that I take makes it into these videos. The Wendat are destroyed. The Iroquois incursions into Wendake were the most deadly. Starting in the late 1630s and for 15 years later, the Wendat and Iroquois confederacies collided. From roughly 1637 to 1652, this collision ended with the dispersal of the Wendat. So there we go again. So, like as I said, the Iroquois were only getting started when they went after the Mohicans. Okay, yeah, and then here's where it lays out the furs, because like I said, it talks about furs way more than it talks about like the hospitality or food or whatever they gave the Dutch. Quote, economically, Iroquois hunters now trapped far less than they had beforehand. It had become easier to steal furs than to trap them. By 1656, Iroquois traders brought nearly 50,000 skins to Fort Orange, a 9-fold increase from the 1630s. Harvested from across the Great Lakes region, the skins had been hunted, processed, and transported by tribes whose stolen labor now fueled Iroquois and Dutch fortunes. So, yeah, it's most detailed on the furs than it is anything else. And here it talks about the institution of Iroquois slavery. In contrast to other 17th century North American slaves, captives taken by Indians were taken for incorporation, not exchange. Indigenous slavery did not evolve in the same way as the Atlantic slavery. This traffic did not center exclusively on economics. Indigenous slavery in New France was driven less by demand for slaves than by demographics and cultural imperatives of enslavement. So basically what this is it's about, they're not grabbing people and, making them like, I don't even know, like work a farm or whatever. Or, I don't know, they're not using them for labor. They're abducting them and trying to bring them in to the fold and trying to, like, make them members of the Iroquois nation. That's, like, how their slavery works, and that's what sets it apart and makes it distinct from the transatlantic slave trade, or perhaps other slave trades. And you can see this in other things as well, that like slavery is just, it's an institution that's existed for thousands and thousands of years. And it's not always the same. And, this is a whole other debate. The book's not about slavery, but that's how theirs works. Theirs is different than the transatlantic slavery. And I'd assume it's different than the slavery of indigenous people by Europeans that it talked about in chapter 2 or I think chapter 1. Yeah, I think chapter 1, the Spanish, is where it talked about Europeans enslaving indigenous people. But this doesn't mean that I say that their slavery is different, but it's not like it's not good. It's not good to be a slave of the Iroquois. And I'm not even making the argument that it's better or worse, but I just want to get across that it's not a good thing, or that they're lucky or whatever. Quote, tortured in ways that included days-long bindings, gauntlets, firebrandings, and fingernail removals, captives experienced harms intended to destroy their previous selves. To a surprising degree, such ceremonial requickening worked. Potentially as many as 10,000 were neutralized into Iroquois families in the half-century following the epidemics of the 1830s. So does that say 10,000? Yeah, so 10,000 in 50 years since the 1630s. Okay. So, again, I'm not trying to get across that it's like a good thing or whatever. I can't think of any slavery that's good off the top of my head, but I just wanted to get that across. And then the Iroquois are going to face off against the French again. And just to give an idea of how far they've come, I've highlighted this part. When Champlain invaded Iroquois in 1615, he confronted archers using stone-tipped arrows. By contrast, on Sunday morning, July 3rd, 1648, so 33 years later, 1,000 Iroquois soldiers annihilated the palisaded Wendat village of Tiannausataya. I'm sorry, I did my best, but anyway. It really goes into how it is showing that it's showing a lot more. This is the book's goal, if I'm not mistaken, is to give indigenous people more agency, to make them not like just passive reactors to like Champlain or Cortez or De Soto or all the other Europeans that are coming over. It's really trying to show what they're doing in this period, and it lays out this sort of, I don't know if it would be fair to call it an empire, but this like Iroquois growth that's just happening. It actually might call them an empire or accuse them of imperialism at some point. But anyway, just to give an idea of the scale, by 1650, an indigenous remapping of the continent was underway and gaining momentum. As the Iroquois displaced Wendat, Petun, Nipissing, Neutral, Erie, and neighboring Algonquin-speaking peoples, their attacks radiated into adjacent regions. Their raids drove refugees farther west, where they encountered other resident powers, such as Siouan-speaking Ho-Chunk, Dakota, and Lakota peoples. There is supposed to be a bit... Here, what does this mean? I highlighted something as me being wrong, apparently. These histories highlight the far... Oh, okay, yeah, I remember this. These histories highlight the far reach of colonial violence and reveal its effects on populations removed from the sites of colonialization. They undo long-standing assumptions about Indian peoples remaining removed from European influence and show the centrality of Indian peoples to the continent's historical evolution, and the growth of European colonies. So this is, in my opinion, the indigenous people trying to adapt as a response to Europe just coming in and creating colonies and trying to facilitate these big trade empires and, all of that. And when I was, I don't know, a kid or whatever, I had always imagined that, like, really only Japan had done that. Only Japan had really tried to modify its ways, or its way of doing things, to like try to better survive, like Europeans coming over to your continent and mucking around, as the British would say. I think that's mucking about. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But this sort of really put that into perspective, and it really did. The book never makes this comparison, so I'm going out on my limb and I'm just saying this, but it really does remind you of the Japanese and how they started getting pushed around by Matthew Perry, the Admiral Matthew Perry, not the actor. They didn't get pushed around by him, but the Japanese got pushed around by Matthew Perry, and I believe by the British, because the British forced unfair treaties on them, and their response to that was to like just arm up, not get extremely militaristic, but militarize to a greater extent, unify, and then push outward into Korea, into Taiwan, into China, and then we all know how that ends. And yeah, this did feel very reminiscent of that, but there's a lot of differences. Like the Europeans are closer to the indigenous people. They only have to cross the Atlantic Ocean, whereas to get to Japan, it's much farther to get to Japan from Europe or America. The indigenous people have to deal with disease on a scale that I don't believe the Japanese had to deal with. So there's a lot of differences, but that's what it was. It was very reminiscent of Japan's imperialism. But again, that's all just my take. That's not. I don't think that I haven't seen this book mention Japan once thus far. Anyway. Oh yeah, it gets into divides in the Iroquois Confederacy, which is very interesting. Seneca leaders prioritized the Confederacy's ongoing western advantages and envisioned further advantages across the Ohio Valley. They also held the long-withstanding animosities with many western nations, several of which had launched similar attacks upon them. Mohawks, in contrast, prioritized their Hudson-based trading relationships, which at times included heeding Dutch calls to arms. So the Mohawks are more interested in protecting the Dutch and trading with the Dutch, and feeling that, I believe the book says it somewhere in here, that Dutch fortunes are sort of tied to Iroquois fortunes, but in the, I believe it's the western part of the Iroquois Confederacy, they just want to keep expanding west, and they don't really pay much heed to the Dutch. Oh yeah, the French are falling, or not really falling apart here, but it's not all going according to plan. With their trade cut off and their allies fleeing, French officials struggled to regain stability as the colony endured Iroquois raids on outlying settlements, trading convoys, and missions. Various peace initiatives were attempted with Iroquois leaders, including a short-lived treaty from 1653 to 1657, in which French leaders abandoned any protections for their Wendat allies. It seemed that the Iroquois were not quite capable of forcing out the French, or in any case, they just didn't force out the French, or couldn't destroy the French, or New France, which is the colony. And so it seemed they had to settle for destroying France's allies. But I don't know. The book doesn't say. Or it's possible that maybe they thought, like, okay, first we'll get rid of New France's allies, then we'll get rid of New France, but they just never got around to the second part. Anyway, this was like sort of devastating to read. Quote, "For the Iroquois, the benefits of war outweighed those of peace." That's not good to hear. Confederacy members held long-standing patterns of conflict resolution, but disagreements about war and peace quickly became too pronounced to resolve, fostering pro as well as anti-Francophone factions. So that's interesting, because not only do you have the divide in their society that I laid out earlier, where they don't know whether to prioritize being friends with the Dutch, or they don't know whether to prioritize westward expansion, but they also have this divide of being pro or anti-France, And it may seem weird to us, like how could any of them be pro-France? What about Champlain's attack? Champlain's attack was like 30 years ago. Things change over the years. It's very easy to forget these things, that as we're like, when you read history books, you may have only traveled like a few pages in a history book, but your subject could have traveled like 10 or 20 years in that time. And so you just have to keep that in mind, that like, you know, things can be more fluid than you think because you're just reading it from a book. They're like actually living day-to-day lives over the course of decades or even just years. But anyway, in my opinion, that's important to keep in mind. And that's about the end of the chapter. At least it would be if it wasn't for the French. Lasting peace took a generation to materialize. Here, let me check my phone notes just to see what we need to get to. What is that? Oh, that's a 3. Oh. I just read a thing that I had to skip. As I said, they weren't able to force out the French. So, along 34. Although the French and their allies had unwoven Iroquois hegemony, neither side could claim supremacy. So this is similar to the Spanish situation that we laid out, where there was like a frontier for the Spanish that they couldn't really cross. They didn't seem to be capable of pushing past, I believe it was the Pueblo people, because the Pueblos were only friends with the Spanish on like certain conditions. The Spanish did not hold absolute authority over the Pueblos, at least when we last checked in. The Pueblos wanted them around to help keep them safe from I forget who it was, but like the equestrian or like raiding indigenous people. So a similar thing is developing here, where the French can't completely dislodge the Confederacy, the Iroquois Confederacy, but the Confederacy can make, you know, life in New France very difficult if they want to. So they have to you know, achieve like some sort of equilibrium, which is what it's called in my notes. And then it just wraps up. I won't read the whole thing, but at the dawn of the 18th century, Louis XIV, who's a huge, important figure in French history, claimed much of North America. The uncharted territory of Louisiana and the settlement at St. Louis even carried his name. The Grand Settlement of 1701 made such claims more than imagined fictions, agreeing to limit their Great Lakes raids in exchange for jurisdiction over native villages across the Ohio River. The Iroquois emerged from a century of war intact and sovereign. So the Iroquois, I believe it said somewhere towards the end of the chapter that Iroquois sovereignty will be broken when we get into like the America part of the book, which, you know, is coming. I don't think the next chapter is America. The next chapter is called The next chapter is called The Native Inland Sea, The Struggle for the Heart of the Continent, 1701 to 1755. So, you know, obviously that's not, you know, the United States. If you're brushed up on American history, you know that, you know, America wasn't born in 1755 or 1701. So, still no United States. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks for listening.